Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. I have power all of a sudden. For the last, about 12 hours ago, our lights came on after 45 hours of being in the cold. So I am power hungry. And man, am I happy to have electricity. And I am also happy to have a return guest, my friend Meredith Angwin. Meredith, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for asking me, Robert.
So, Meredith, we talked, I think, in October about your recent book, Shorting the Grid, and you are shorting the grid, the hidden fragility of our electric grid, which is available at all fine booksellers. But I am a victim of a recent blackout, and you've introduced yourself before. Let's jump right in. What is going on? Why am I getting blacked out? What is the story?
Well, the story is, in my opinion, basically grid mismanagement. And I hate to say that because it isn't that the managers of the grid are just screwing up right and left. It's that the rules that set up the grid do not care about reliability. They don't have anything set up so that you could be reliable. As an example, most grids have 15% or so redundancy. That is, that they have 15% more power plants available than they would need at what they consider to be peak demand.
And is that what's called the reserve margin? Is that what?
Yes, that's the reserve margin.
Okay, all right.
That's the reserve margin. And the idea is that at peak demand, some portion of power plants won't be available because no power plant is available all the time. But with a 15% reserve margin, you're probably going to be okay. Texas has always had the lowest reserve margin in the continental United States, as far as it's been like 8%. If you follow things like RTO Insider and stuff, it's always like, trade magazines, I shouldn't have just named one. You always say, well, Texas is projecting that they'll squeak through the summer again despite low margins. And you probably see headlines of that like that in Texas. You don't have to go to a trade magazine if you're already in Texas. So I think that is the main thing that is going on. Now, one question is, why are margins low? And the answer is you've got to look at economic incentives. If you don't have a promise that you'll be paid for building a new plant, maybe you won't build it, because after all, how many hours will it be on the grid? It made it in the old days, and I don't want to get all nostalgic because they had their problems too, but in the old days, the investor-owned utility, or not investor-owned, could be any utility, it was vertically integrated. It owned the power plant. It owned or rented transmission lines. It owned the substation. It owned the wire to your house. And if you wanted to call somebody up and say something's going wrong, you knew who to call. Nowadays, you don't know who to call, because the RTO is the one who dispatches power plants, but the RTO can't order a power plant to be built. The PUC.
So if I can interrupt for just a second here, Meredith, because I want to make sure everybody's following.
Oh gosh, that's terrible. Sorry.
No. You're going fine. The RTOs are the regional transmission organization. So here in Texas, that's ERCOT. In the
right.
Central U.S., it's MISO. In the East, it's PJM. New York has its own, the New York ISO, and then in New England, the New England ISO, right? So
yeah, ISO New England.
ISO New England. So rather than having an integrated, the old model, which was the fully integrated and regulated utilities, now that's all been disbanded in favor of regulation or oversight, I would maybe is the right word, by the RTOs.
Yes, the RTOs don't regulate. They dispatch. They set up the auctions. They design rules for the auctions. What are these auctions? Okay, these auctions are the distribution utility, which is actually going to send some power to your house, bids on a generator producing the power. So it got to get the power from somewhere. It doesn't have its own power plant. So it bids in these auctions. And the RTOs, like ERCOT, set up the rules for the auctions. And these rules don't have anything to do with reliability. I mean, and that's the major problem. And they also don't have anything to do with building a reserve margin. A plant, somebody wants to build it and they can get permission from the PUC and they can get permits, they can go on. But if they don't want to build it, nobody's going to say, you know, we need a new power plant here. Well, this area is getting a little shaky. We need to do more.
So well, let me interrupt, because I think this is key in terms of, I'm in Texas. As I said, we spent 45 hours in the dark, in the cold, or in the cold, and a lot of it in the dark. But we were lucky. We have natural gas. We plumbed in natural gas when we bought this house. We had plenty of firewood. We had water supply. So, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to cry about it. We're pretty comfortable. But to bring it back to your point about the economic incentives and the lack of reserve margin, to go back to that. So fundamentally, are you saying in ERCOT that it was the lack of reserve margin there wasn't enough spare capacity then to come on when things tripped off?
Well, that was the beginning of it for sure. The next stages are part of the two parts of the what I call the fatal trifecta, which is that there was a lot of reliance on renewables, specifically wind. Now, in a way, there wasn't reliance on wind, because if you watch the pro-renewables and anti-renewables people going at it right now, the pro-renewables people said, we were making as much wind as we were expected to make. I mean, basically, we only make about, 10% of the wind during the winter. During the winter isn't a windy time. We don't make a lot of wind here. So the grid wasn't expecting more than we were making. So that's so
they're saying, well, our capacity factor was expected to be low, therefore we're not, our capacity factor, that is how often we're going to be actually producing power at full tilt. The RTO, ERCOT wasn't expecting much from us. We didn't deliver much, therefore it's not our fault. Is that the essence of their argument?
That's the essence of their argument. Then the other part of the argument is that, well, yeah, but supposedly Texas gets like 30% of its total power for wind, and you can just say, oh, in bad weather we go away, and we're all supposed to say, yeah, that's fine, we love it. No, I mean, so I think one of the things is that there always has to be something that's backing up wind or solar, because wind and solar go away and come on more or less when they want to. Now, you can make them not come online. If your lines are overloaded, you can curtail wind, it's called. You say, I'm sorry, wind turbines, don't put your power online. But you can't order it up. You can't say, hey, 8 more turbines, start spinning. No, because, it's like
it can't be dispatched.
It can't be dispatched. It can only be curtailed. It cannot be dispatched. So here we have the fact that we have something that may not be available. Everybody knows it may not be available. So you have to have pretty much 100% backup of that with something which you can dispatch. And in Texas, that is natural gas. Most places it's natural gas. Now you say, well, we have coal in Texas, and we have nuclear plants in Texas, and that's true. And that means that you've got a kind of baseline, and that the wind or natural gas are on top of that. But the thing is, if let's say all you've got going is your baseline, and all of a sudden the wind goes away and the natural gas has frozen valves and you can't get it either, then you have a problem.
Right. So you've talked about this, and we'll follow up on the fatal trifecta, because I think this is in your book. You make a lot of great points, but you made this point when we talked on the podcast last time,
yes,
specifically about California. What's the fatal trifecta?
The fatal trifecta is the following: you decide that you're going to be a grid that is going to have a lot of renewables on it, okay? And you know that renewables go on and off. You say, okay, I'm going to back it up with a lot of natural gas. So you say, oh, well, natural gas, right? The trouble with natural gas is it's just-in-time delivery. It can be interrupted. It can be interrupted by the simple fact that in really cold weather, lots and lots of houses buy natural gas and heat their houses with it, and there's less available for the power plants. For many reasons, power plants are not in front of houses in line for natural gas, because the idea is a power plant, for example, could have kept some distillate fuel on site and use it. If you have a natural gas furnace in your house, you don't also have a lot of ability for different nozzles, different types of fuels, and so forth.
Right.
So anyway, so the first part of the fatal trifecta is a lot of renewables, which go on and off when they want to. The second is backing that up with just-in-time natural gas, which may not be available because all of a sudden it's in tremendous demand in the winter. All of a sudden, other power plants may be icing up, and so you want to put on more natural gas power plants, but they don't have the gas. Okay, and the third part of the fatal trifecta is is much more visible in California and in New England than here, and that is that people just say, hey, we're not the only grid in the world. If we're having problems, we'll get some from our neighbors. The reason that that's a problem is if you're having problems because of weather issues don't stop at the grid line. Weather issues go across big swatches of the continent. So for the first time I encountered this, we were having a polar vortex in New England. And I was checking, where's our power coming from? I didn't know that much about it. This was in 2013, I think. And I thought, well, for heaven's sake, Hydro-Quebec is supposed to send us more power. They're sending us half the power they usually do. Well, you know why? Because they needed it in Quebec. And,
Sure.
When you get right down to it, and the other thing is, and we could go into this, I didn't know this, they had actually only taken on an obligation to send us half the power. The rest of what other power we got above that was their goodwill toward us, and they needed it at home. We couldn't sue them for not sending it. They were only obligated to send us half the power that they usually send.
Sure. So just to review then, the fatal trifecta is too much reliance on renewables, just-in-time natural gas, and imports. And
Right.
that was really the gist of the failure in California, which I think all the reviews of that have pointed to that exact same thing. So let me shift gears a little bit, because there's a lot of finger pointing over what's going on in ERCOT, right? And as you point out on Twitter, it's just very interesting to watch the pro-renewables crowd jumping up and down saying, oh, it's not our fault, it's not our fault, it's not our fault, it's the gas guys, right? But to me, as you know, I've written about this. Oh, well, the view of the all renewable crowd is where we're going to eliminate gas. And now suddenly they're saying, oh, no, we don't have enough gas, which to me is, pretty ironic. And I'd say it's funny, except that it's indicative, in my view, well, is it a fatal flaw in their thinking? How do you see their positioning on this?
Well, I see it as totally inconsistent, as you do. In other words, if they're going to say we were doing great, it was the gas guys at fault, are they really thinking that they could do 100%? They count on those gas guys because, imagine you're only getting, maybe 15% of the wind energy that you think that you have installed wind turbines.
The total capacity you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
So you're only getting 15% and you're backing it up with gas. If you had to back it up with wind turbines, well, first of all, the wind might not be there at all. There's such a thing as a lull. Okay. And the second thing is that, let's say you have to take that, the wind turbines, and you take that 15%, and you've got to have enough wind turbines so that 15% is all the wind you need. That is going to be a lot of wind turbine, a lot of expense. And the trouble is, I don't like to talk about expense. And you know why I don't like to talk about it? Because if the crowd that is very concerned with we've got to shift to 100% renewables, they go back and forth between we have to save the planet even if it's more expensive, and renewables are the cheapest thing around anyway, not counting the fact they have to be backed up.
Well, that's a great point, because one of the things that I'm looking at, and I've talked to some people in the gas business, is that the electricity bills that people are going to see in the wake of this blizzard are likely to be gargantuan. Have you thought about that, or what's your any visibility on that?
Well, I don't know how much they're going to be allowed to pass through to the end user.
The utilities may be limited.
They may be limited. In other words, what you may be seeing is utilities going bankrupt. This happened in California during the very early outages. They weren't allowed to pass through all the money that they were paying during a scarcity condition. They were paying all this money for electricity to the generating plants, and then they couldn't pass it through to the ratepayers. And I think that is something that may be happening again. And as a matter of fact, I'm following it a little, and I mean, I'm trying to follow it as best I can, but it may actually be happening now, because apparently some utilities have gone to this situation and said, some distribution utilities have gone to the situation and said, I actually can't afford to buy the electricity right now. I can't get reimbursed for it. I can't afford to buy it. All I can do is black out my service area. That's what I got to do, because I mean, there's no magical pot of money for me to pay this stuff.
Right. Well, and that seems to me a direct follow-on to this disaggregation, right? It's interesting. I think it's interesting. I hope you do, but my first book was on Enron. I published it 20 years ago. When Enron went bankrupt, we were using about 5 trillion cubic feet of gas per day, or 5 trillion cubic feet of gas per year for power gen. Now it's over 11 trillion cubic feet. So we've seen it in the last 20 years, a complete change in the natural gas market and the natural gas's role in the electricity business. But what I'm hearing now is that the disintermediation, which Enron word, this is the point that I'm getting to. Well, we're going to disintermediate. So, that's what happened in the largely in the electric utility business, including here in Texas, that there are these retail electric providers, they're the distribution companies, they're the generators, but ultimately the buck doesn't stop anywhere, right? So that there's no one, is this your fundamental point, that there's no one ultimately responsible for reliability?
Yes, that is the point. And one of the things is that there are groups that advise on it. For example, National Electricity Reliability Council, NERC, may bring up a statement saying, we consider the Texas reliability to be suboptimal. We think they should do something about it. NERC isn't responsible for Texas reliability. NERC is only responsible for saying, we've made a study and it isn't good. Okay.
Well, that's okay. Well, I'll come. Let's come back to NERC in just a minute. So, you said, okay. Why did nuclear outperform? Because I think that's like you. I believe if we're serious about decarbonization, we need nuclear. We need a lot more. And yet we're seeing this year plants in Illinois and New York are slated for closure. But South Texas Project and Comanche Peak, both of all the forms of generation, those plants did better than any other in staying online. Why were the nuclear plants so good in the blackout?
Okay, a couple of things. First thing is that they have fuel stored on site. Just like we decided to put nuclear power plants on our Navy ships, some of them, because then you don't have to be refueled at sea or refueled in a port that might have turned hostile to you. You see?
Right.
We put them on Navy ships because the power is there. Well, a nuclear plant has 18 months worth of power on site in the reactor, ready to go. Now, if it's been running for 6 months, it only has a year's worth. But what I'm saying is that
that's still a year's worth of fuel that they don't have to wait. That they don't have there's no truck. It's not going to be stopped by an ice storm or something else. And that was one of the key issues that Rick Perry pushed, right, when he was Secretary of Energy. And was met with this fierce backlash, did it not?
Oh, they just absolutely laughed at him. They thought, oh yeah, sure, he's just trying to save coal. That's what he's trying to do. And as I wrote in my book, Rick Perry comes from a state with a lot of natural gas reserves. And so if he's saying we need more than natural gas, we need fuel stored on site at some of our power plants, at many of our power plants. He's not saying that because he hates natural gas. He's saying that because he knows that just-in-time delivery is not a very resilient model.
Well, and that's such a key, because that's one of the things that, to me, and I wrote it in the piece that I published in Forbes on Monday, that we've had all this talk about resilience in our society recently, after 9/11, after Superstorm Hurricane Sandy, after, obviously, we're still in the midst of the coronavirus. And here was Perry saying, well, no, this is a method of resilience. This is a way for, for energy security. And it got absolutely nowhere. I mean, I was really, as you point out, it was ridiculed, but it wasn't a DOE decision, right? It was a FERC matter. Was that ultimately their responsibility of trying to enforce it? How did that play out? I've forgotten.
Well, the way it played out is he didn't get to do what he wanted to do. And the reason was that, as I said in my book, FERC doesn't want you to name that fuel. It wants everything to do with a market where all fuels are treated the same. Okay, no, you don't get to say natural gas is good for this and nuclear is good for that. You treat them all the same. Well, this is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, it's sort of like trying to build a business and saying, well, I think that the engineers should have really, really good spelling skills, and the people who are in our public relations department had better really understand the engineering they're talking about and be willing to actually make suggestions about it. And I mean, no, different people have different skill sets. Different fuels have different skill sets, if you look at it that way. And yet FERC was like, no, it's all done by the auctions, and the auctions have to treat everybody the same. And so you going around saying we got to store fuel on site, you're giving an advantage to the fuel that's stored on site. That isn't allowed, not allowed. No, don't do it.
I hear in your voice this kind of, well, it's not anger, it's just kind of this frustration, or I mean, how do you describe your feeling about it? Because I mean, you've lived with these ideas. I know how hard it is to write a book, and now you're seeing this real life situation that you wrote about, warned about, thought about for years. Is there any feeling of vindication, or are you just mad that no one was really paying attention?
I think I'm more mad than no one was paying attention. I mean, I feel like somebody who has been running around saying, those guys, they're massing their troops on our border. Have you noticed that? I mean, they're massing them. I mean, we can see it in the satellites. Well, you're vindicated if they invade, but it doesn't make you happy.
I like that analogy. So back to the FERC thing about and this idea that Texas it was an energy only market, right? No capacity payments. We're going to have a sky high number. If we have peak demand, those generators will be able to make the money during those times of peak demand. So the short question is this a market failure?
It's a market failure, and I would like to say, though, that everybody's blaming it on the fact that Texas is energy only and doesn't have a capacity market. We have seen similar market failures in New England. It didn't get all the way to, New England has a capacity market, but when it comes right down to it, the power plants don't go online if they can't get natural gas. And nothing is really, setting up a market is not an answer to having overloaded natural gas pipelines that can't deliver as much as they need to deliver. I mean, what you have to do for that is build the pipelines, and build incentives to build plants that have fuel stored on site so that not every single bit of fuel has to come through a pipeline. I mean, I guess.
Well, if I can interrupt there, because I think that's a critical point, that the gas generators, and as I understand it, didn't have pipeline capacity and firm delivery contracts, right? That they were
Yes,
interruptible contracts. So that goes to your point about, well, they weren't going to go ahead and spend that money to make sure they had firm delivery, because there was no, to go back to your point about the economic incentives weren't there.
that's right. There's no economic incentive for them to pay extra for gas for firm delivery, because what will happen is, let's say there's no crisis and there's a power plant that didn't make a firm contract and a power plant that did. The power plant that did is paying more money, but they're both getting the same money on the auctions. Okay. Now let's say there's a crisis. So the power plant that didn't get didn't have firm delivery may not be able to get online, but let's say it can get online some of the time. Well, both of those power plants are going to make those really high prices that are running on the auctions. So you see, the thing is that the power plant that didn't get a firm contract may be doing just fine. Because if it gets on at all, it's going to make tons of money. I have a section in my book, and I know that you're going to be interviewing a friend of mine, Jim Bryce, fairly soon, but he is a really good explanation of what he calls, and many other people call, the search for the missing money. That is, the power plants can't make it on selling kilowatt hours at the average auction price. They end up not being able to buy fuel if the fuel gets too expensive. I mean, and so I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's no incentive for a plant to have that firm price, firm contract. Let us imagine that a plant decides it's going to have that firm contract.
Just to remind everybody, that's for firm delivery of the gas. So
for firm delivery, uninterruptible delivery of the gas.
If I own a power plant and I need 1 billion cubic feet a day, I'm going to get a contract with both the supplier and the pipeline that guarantees at a certain price that I'll get that 1 billion cubic feet per day, no matter what. And I have to pay a premium for that, because if I get the guaranteed delivery, that's a higher price than if I agree to have it interrupted or only get half of that, right? Just to be clear. Okay, all right.
That's right. So, well, the thing is that for 3 years in a row, the clearing price on the auction is not going to be different from either of them. And both of them will be able to get online, both the power plant with the interruptible and the power plant with the non-interruptible. They'll both get on they'll get their plants online and they'll get the clearing price of the auction. The only difference is, for 3 years, the one with the non-interruptible contract is paying more for the gas, getting the same price as the other guy, but paying more for the gas. So then in the 4th year, there's a big crisis, and the guy with the interruptible contract can't get online, and the guy with the firm contract gets online and is making thousands of dollars every day, over what tens of thousands every day over what he would have made otherwise. Well, that's kind of gambling, isn't it? He's got to buy this extra pipeline firmness, this guaranteed delivery, for years before it pays off. Well, what if it doesn't pay off for 8 years? What if it pays off the next year? I mean, big companies that are supplying very big quantities of commodities don't actually like to play that kind of game. I might be paid off in 8 years. I might be paid off next year. How does that look to your shareholders?
Well, and it doesn't do much for the trader or the entrepreneur who's knows that his bonus depends on his profit this year, not in 8 years.
Exactly. Right. That's right.
Well, so then this seems to lead to the obvious question then, Meredith, what should be done? I think you fairly well identified this lack of economic incentives. Well, actually, before we get to that, the other thing that's been clear and stated over and over by the pro-renewable people, and particularly about what's going on in ERCOT, is, I'm going to make it as short as I can, Well, this kind of weather, nobody could ever plan for it. I mean, this is unprecedented, and it is unprecedented. 6 inches of snow. I mean, I've never seen it snow like this in Austin. So what's your response to the people who say, well, this blizzard, nobody could have, predicted this? How do you reply to that?
Well, I'm going to say that if you were talking about down power lines over an extended area, I might say, oh yeah, that comes rarely. That's true. You can't necessarily predict it. I mean, we had an ice storm in the Northeast one time that took down amazing numbers of power lines. And, you can't predict when such a thing will happen. But this isn't the same kind of situation. This is a situation where power plants were not performing as they should. And that's a market question. That isn't, there wasn't a power plant that just was so, it was destroyed by a tornado or something. I don't know how to describe it, but the difference is that when there's distribution and the problems in transmission and distribution, those problems are often unpredictable, except to say that they'll come when things are getting icy or during tornado season or during, hurricane season. But
and that's the poles and wire part of it, right? Which is
yes.
Right. That one guy in the power business said, yeah, this is a poles and wire business. You're going to be in this business. You got to have poles, you got to have wires, but that's wholly separate from the generation part.
That's right. And the things that were happening here were happening in the generation part, and they were happening for economic reasons as much as anything else. In other words, some gas-fired plants went offline because they had frozen valves. Some gas-fired plants went offline because they couldn't afford to buy gas. And that latter one is an economic question. It's not a poles and wires question. I guess the thing is that people kind of conflate things. They push things together to make the point. It's a rhetorical thing. In other words, everybody knows that things are harder in the winter. Everybody knows, for example, if I had an appointment and it's been snowing out there, I might cancel the appointment, or I would certainly leave really early for it so I wouldn't have to race down the street. Right? We know things are harder when the weather is bad. And so we are likely to give everybody a pass on that, even though it is not about the weather per se. It's about the market of incentives for reserve margin. It's about the market incentives for a power plant being able to buy gas and so forth. It's about is there any incentive to build a new power plant that's coal or nuclear? Nuclear is my favorite, but that stores fuel on site so that the gas lines don't have to carry as much because one of these power plants is right there ready to take, always going. There's incentives that have not been aligned with being reliable, and that's what it boils down. To me, that's what it boils down to.
Is that the economic incentives, if I'm paraphrasing what you said, the economic incentives in ERCOT didn't incent reliability.
Absolutely. You said it much better than I did. You said it, I don't have to say anymore.
Well, so Jim, I've been in touch with Jim Bride, and I want to have him on the podcast, and you mentioned him earlier. In an email to me, he said that this market, this energy only market in Texas, because of the way it's structured, as I recall, his message to me was, well, because that if you want to, he said it made it impossible to finance a new gas-fired power plant because you can't predict how often it might be used, right? What that capacity factor would be, and therefore you can't predict the return on capital. Do you agree with that?
I think that's probably true. The thing is that the way it goes in areas where you have a capacity auction, the power plants or someone who wants to build a power plant, the capacity auction is for 3 years in advance. So let's say I'm thinking I want to build a power plant. And I bid into the capacity auction, and I say, if I build this power plant, you'll have to pay me this amount because I've got a good power plant and I'm bidding in at a really very reasonable price. And let's say I clear the auction. Well, then I get a sort of piece of paper from ISO, which says, you cleared the auction 3 years from now with a power plant of so many megawatts, you can expect so many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in capacity payments. And I can take that piece of paper over to a bank and say, I got it. I know it's all a big complex world here, but I got it. I have a guarantee I will be able to pay you back.
And just to be clear, that capacity payment is just for the operator to have that power plant ready to go when it's needed.
Exactly. It's only for the capacity to have that power plant when it's needed. It is not about that capacity payment will be there if the operator doesn't supply a single kilowatt hour to the grid because the grid doesn't need their kilowatt hour.
So this would be, if I can interrupt again, but this was similar to a power purchase agreement, except so it's a capacity agreement. It's a capacity payment. A power purchase agreement is one where the generator gets a signed deal with an off-taker to take as many watt hours as they produce over a certain period. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, that's a fair description. There are different kinds of power purchase agreements, so I don't want to say that's the one. I mean, we made one with Hydro-Quebec that I could never figure out. So anyhow, but basically the capacity payment, the whole point of the capacity payment is what they call CONE, cost of new entry, that it allows people to build a new plant because the capacity payment is a significant portion of the cost of new entry, the capital cost of new entry. It's not the whole thing, but it's enough so you can go to the bank and say, it's looking good. You know, if you lend me money, the chances I'm going to default on it are very bad. I won't be defaulting. I'll be there for you. Now that I brought up, I'll be there for you. I want you to know that that's the power plant owner talking to a bank. Right. Now we talk about ISO New England or ERCOT talking to a power plant owner. Let's just go with ISO New England because it has a capacity payment. So the ISO New England says, you have taken a capacity payment and we need you, come online. The plant may say, no, I can't. I'm down for repairs. I can't get the gas. I'm sorry, my cat ate my homework. I mean, they can say anything they want and not come online. And it turned out that in a fair portion of my book is about ISO New England trying to make rule after rule after rule to make plants that have already received capacity payments come online when called. They, to be fined if they don't come online, to have to pay their capacity payment to a plant that does come online, and so forth and so on, rule after rule. So from the point of view of building new power plants, it's probably good. From the point of view of reliability, it's a mixed bag. It's not a guarantee that they'll be there for you. The plant will be there for you.
I got you. So I just want to touch on a few more questions because I'm eager to get this podcast posted today. But one of the things that I keep coming back to in all of this, Meredith, is the nomenclature in the business. Energy is the ability to do work, power is the rate at which work gets done. Energy is watt hours, power is measured in watts. It seems to me, and I'm curious to get your view on this, that the basic contract in the business is a power purchase agreement. And the renewable, if you have a wind plant, a solar plant, if you say you're going to build this many, say 100 megawatts, and you're going to produce this many watt hours, well, you can go into the market and sell the power purchase agreement or get a power purchase agreement with an off-taker. But those contracts are misnamed. They're not providing power, they're providing energy. So that when, here's my thought, and tell me if I'm missing this. One of the fundamental distortions, it seems to me, in Texas in particular, is that these big renewable providers, whether it's solar or wind, they've signed power purchase agreements, but they're not required to deliver power when power is dear. Their only requirement is to provide watt hours, not watts. Am I missing something? If I'm in the weeds here?
No, the trouble is that it really, you're right, but I get very confused about all this. No, I understand the difference between a watt and a watt hour. I'm not confused about that. But what I'm trying to say is that the usual renewable statement around here is something like, we're building four 2 megawatt wind turbines. We're going to have 8 megawatts of wind on the system, and that'll be enough to power X houses.
Right.
What do you mean by that? I mean, you don't power a house with a megawatt. You power a house with the kilowatt hours that the house is going to use. And so they get away from having to say, oh, we're going to have 8 megawatts of wind on the system. And since the wind capacity factor around here is about 20% or 40%, that is going to be, we're going to have about so many megawatt hours available. I mean, they don't go there. They really don't like to go from, we built such a big wind turbine to how much it can actually supply to the house. Now, the other thing you're saying, though, is that you see, if somebody has decided to buy a certain number of watt hours from a wind turbine or a solar panel, they are buying those watt hours when they're available, not when they're needed. And that's a really, really different situation. And let me give you another example, and that is, I think it was Vermont, but maybe it was it was Vermont, made a deal with Hydro-Quebec, and they made a deal to buy power from Hydro-Quebec. And they made the deal that they could buy 16 hours of power a day at a time convenient to the state of Vermont. So in other words, Hydro-Quebec has to turn on its dams when Vermont wants it. Now, of course, people really try to get along with each other and so forth. And so they're not going to just say, turn it on now, turn it off now. They're going to say, we'll probably need it tomorrow between about 9:30 a.m. and 4:30 in the afternoon. And then again around 8 to midnight, because the Super Bowl is on and everybody will have their TVs going. I mean, so they do plan ahead for this, but the idea is that is an agreement for a certain number of watt hours per day.
And that's a power deal. That's a power agreement. That's a power agreement, not an energy contract.
That's right. It's a power purchase agreement.
Because they're required to deliver power when power is needed, not energy when it's not needed. And that's the part that I see when I look at the ERCOT situation. I see, oh, wind, it's available. Oh, look at this massive amount of wind that's coming in. We did 60% today. Well, that's fine. It's warm and sunny, and the power demand is low. But when it was 12 degrees the other morning, there was no wind. And so I guess the way I thought about it is that the renewable providers, and I have solar on the roof of my house, they're free riding on the other generators. Is that a fair? Well, how would you describe it? Is it free riding? How do you describe that?
Well, they are. The thing is, they don't pay for the system's costs of backing them up or providing power when it's needed, as opposed to when they feel like providing it. I mean, so it is a definite problem that they try to work around this with some things like ELCC, energy, something load carrying capacity. I forget the first word, ELCC. What it means is, how well does our wind pattern match when you need power and the load carrying capacity of wind. There are other studies that show that the more wind you put on the system, or the more solar you put on the system, the less valuable it is, because it's all coming on at the same time. So when you need it, you don't necessarily have it. You have it when you have it. You might have too much. You might have to curtail
Well, so let's just explore that one point really quickly, because I've heard this idea.
Effective load carrying capacity. Thank you.
Effective load. Okay. So, but your point about the higher the penetration, because I've seen a lot of studies have been done on this, that if you go from every increment, let's just pick a number, from 35% wind to 45 to 55, each of those incremental percentages as they stack on each other become less valuable to the grid. Is that a way to describe it?
Yes.
And why? And why is that?
Well, because they come on when they want to, and so you're more likely to curtail them. They're more likely to be on when the grid doesn't need them, and the grid may actually have to curtail them if it can't turn down some other. A wind turbine that's not making any wind isn't very useful.
I see. So if on a particularly sunny day, if there's it's the duck. Is this the duck curve in California, where there's just you have so much generation that there's no off takers, and so they have to curtail or export? Is that what we're talking about?
We're talking about the equivalent of a duck curve for wind and the equivalent of a duck curve for solar. There's so much that you either have to curtail or export. And you say, well, the thing to do is just not have any other kind of plants on the grid, to go to 100% renewable. Well, yeah, but what about the next day when the wind isn't blowing, or there's a big weather system moving in and it's all cloudy?
And it's 12 degrees and your batteries are frozen.
Yeah.
Well, so give me your thoughts on batteries. You like batteries? What are batteries a good idea? This is again, another area we're hearing just a ton about, and Elon Musk is part of this. Oh, we're going to store all this energy. And is that even viable in a situation like the blizzard that I'm looking at all the snow in my yard here thinking, are batteries a good idea?
Batteries are overhyped. I will never say they're a bad idea, because batteries and a solar in your house can give you more hours of your own generation than if you didn't have the batteries. I mean, there's no question about that. But they're overhyped. They can't really back up a grid. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but they can't, because the biggest batteries that are around, and Elon Musk built some big batteries down in Australia. They will back up a major power plant for 3 hours or something. I mean, they're not going to back up the grid because they're very expensive, and they're very I would tend to say sluggish, but I don't know how to say. I mean, you have to set aside the time to charge them. I mean, if you want to turn on a diesel generator, how long is it going to take you? Okay, not very.
Minute or two, yeah.
Yeah, right. If you think you're going to use a battery tonight, you better think ahead and get that thing charged up over a period of time. If you're charging it with renewables, with solar or something.
And then you have the round trip efficiency problem, right? Because
that's
you lose
right.
20% charging it up and discharging it, right? And
that's right.
And you mentioned backup for 3 hours. Well, I was without power for 45 hours. That's a long time for a battery. And as I remember, batteries are kind of finicky. Like what is it? Who was Little Red Riding Hood? Not too hot, not too cold. No, not too hot, not too soft. It's got to be just right? The temperature and everything else.
Yeah, batteries tend to be finicky. I mean, there's reasons people like power plants with fuel, whether it's natural gas, coal, nuclear. I mean,
with fuel on site.
Fuel on site, you know where it is and you turn it on.
Right. Well, so let me just go to the end here, because I want to make sure we keep this less than an hour, Meredith, and you've been great with your time. Again, my guest is Meredith Angwin. She is the author. Most recently, she's published 3 books, is Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. Okay, so a final question. I promise it will be the last one here, Meredith. What to do? What's the solution?
Well, the solution, I mean, I don't have a perfect solution for everything, but I would say the first solution is keep every power plant that has fuel stored on site going for as long as you can keep it going. In other words, refurbish it, bring it back bring it back to tip-top condition and use it. And I would say that is especially true for nuclear, because I mean, I'm not particularly fond of standing here and saying, hey, let's refurbish all the coal plants. But when you get right down to it, if you want a resilient grid, you need plants that have fuel on site. Rick Perry said it, I said it, that's the way it is. And then above that, you can have just-in-time delivery. You can have renewables that go on and off when they want to, as long as you protect the power plants that keep fuel on site from being forced off the grid by weird rules in the auctions. And I have a whole book about weird rules in the auction, so I won't go into it. But what I'm trying to say is they can end up meaning that the plants that keep fuel on site are not economically viable. And you don't want that to happen, because you want those plants that keep fuel on site. So that's my basic idea, is that you need the base load of the plants that keep fuel on site, and then the other plants can keep fuel on site or not keep fuel on site, or whatever. But you know, you guys got into I've never seen anything like it in a way, because even the California blackouts didn't get to the point where the real demand on the grid would have been 70 gigawatts and the grid could only supply 45. That's what you guys were at.
Well, I was really shocked yesterday when Jackie Sargent, who's the general manager of Austin Energy, she said during a press conference that they were very close to having the grid shut down completely. I mean,
I was shocked. I looked at it and I said, I have never seen anything like this. I lived through the California blackouts in 2001, and they were trivial. I mean, they were trivial. But what I'm trying to say is the kind of blackouts you were having in Texas, they give rotating outages a bad name, because they weren't rotating outages, they were blackouts.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add one other quick thought, Meredith, and maybe I know I said it was the last question, but I've also written a fair amount about the technology sector and data centers that owned by Google, Amazon, Facebook, all the rest of them. They have their fuel on site. They have those big reciprocating diesel gen sets, and they have big tanks of diesel fuel there. But it goes to your point about they're not going to mess around with reliability. They have to make sure that that generation is there and reliable, and they can point to that big old tank of fuel and, well, that's enough for a week or however long, right? So
exactly.
that's a resiliency measure that the biggest tech companies in the world are taking. But your point is that the grid that we're relying on so much doesn't. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a fair statement. We really have to recognize that the grid has to be managed for resiliency. It has to be managed to be there for us, because when it isn't there for us, like I say, a friend of mine, her daughter is was in a cold apartment in Austin, and her daughter went to a warming station that apparently has been set up in Austin. But then she was worried about her daughter being in this warming station, which was set up like at the last minute, and whether it's got good protection from all the people who'll be sleeping there about COVID. She doesn't know. That is, my friend doesn't know. And she's like, oh my God, I mean, be really cold in your apartment, or go to a hastily set up place that will keep you warm, but may not be up to the protocols you'd like to not get sick.
It's a hell of a choice. I mean, it really is. And that's one of the reasons why I felt really, I wasn't happy about being blacked out, but we have firewood. I was out cutting firewood more this morning, and we had gas on our cooktop, and we had hot water, and we had running water. And so it was, it was cold, but it was bearable. But anyway, that I won't talk, I didn't bring you on to talk about.
The resiliency of the grid is really important. It is not trivial. It is not something we can give up easily for some ideological principle. And I want to, and even if the ideological principle is the one that's dearest to my heart, I wrote a book called Campaigning for Clean Air. Okay, clean air is important to me, but I'm trying to say that if the grid is just terribly, terribly important to everybody's health. And you wrote a book and a movie about that. I think you know it. They're very good, very good. Let me give a plug for your movie Juice. It is fabulous.
Well, that's very kind, Meredith. And on that note, we will stop because I didn't invite you on to talk about my stuff. But listen, it's been great. I want to get this podcast up today because it's very current. Meredith, thanks for your time again, and you're charming as always. And we will be in touch soon. Everyone else out there in podcast land, if you like this podcast, give it 6, 12, 24 stars on your favorite podcast outlet, and tune into the next edition of the Power Hungry podcast. And of course, follow Meredith Angwin. She's on Twitter at Meredith Angwin. So until then, thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.